The grizzly bear stood motionless at the tree line, watching through the blizzard as Thomas Makepeace knelt beside his creation. The pyramid of death rose 6 feet from the snow, wooden poles lashed with rope, deer carcasses bound to the framework, skulls and antlers jutting outward like grasping fingers, and blood staining the white ground in a crimson circle that stretched 20 feet in every direction. Thomas had spent 3 weeks building this monument to attract the most dangerous predator in the Montana wilderness, and now, in the fury of a November storm, the bear was coming. What happened next would either prove Thomas was a genius or prove he had lost his mind to grief. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. And if stories of frontier survival and forgotten wilderness techniques move you, hit subscribe because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable. The winter of 1837 came early to the Montana wilderness. By late October, snow already blanketed the valleys along the Bitterroot River, and the high country had become impassable. For mountain men like Thomas Makepeace and Henry Dalton, this was both the most dangerous and most profitable time of year. Beaver pelts grew thick in the cold, commanding premium prices at the St. Louis trading posts, but the same cold that improved the fur could kill a man in hours if he made a single mistake. Thomas and Henry had been partners for 3 seasons. They knew each other's rhythms, trusted each other's judgment, and split everything down the middle: the work, the profits, the risks. Their camp sat in a protected hollow near the confluence of 2 creeks, a location they had selected specifically because it offered access to multiple beaver ponds while remaining far enough from established trails to avoid unwanted attention from rival trappers or hostile raiding parties. On the morning of October 23rd, they rose before dawn as always. The fight pines. Temperature had dropped during the night, and frost covered the inside of their small canvas tent. Henry boiled coffee over the fire, while Thomas checked their supplies. They had 47 pelts stretched and drying, enough to justify a trip to the trading post, but both men wanted to push for 60 before making the long journey east. Henry volunteered to check the northern trap line, a circuit of 12 traps spread along a creek 3 miles from camp. Thomas would stay behind to process the previous day's catch and repair a torn pack saddle. It was a routine division of labor they had performed dozens of times. Henry took his rifle, his possibles bag with powder and lead, and a leather satchel for carrying pelts. He left camp just after sunrise, following a game trail that wound through the pine forest toward the distant creek. Thomas worked through the morning, scraping flesh from beaver hides and stretching them on willow frames. The work was tedious but necessary. Improperly processed pelts would rot or stiffen, losing value. He had processed 8 hides and started on the 9th when he heard the shots. 3 rifle cracks in rapid succession, coming from the direction Henry had gone. Then silence. A single shot might mean Henry had taken game deer or elk for camp meat. 2 shots might mean a miss followed by a killing shot. But 3 shots meant trouble. Thomas grabbed his rifle and started running. He found Henry 2 miles from camp, near a beaver dam where one of their traps had been set. The trap was sprung and empty. Henry lay 30 feet away in torn snow stained dark with blood. A grizzly bear had attacked him, probably while Henry knelt checking the trap. The bear had struck without warning. Henry had managed to fire all 3 shots from his rifle, but none had stopped the animal. The enraged grizzly had killed Henry with terrible efficiency, then dragged his body away from the trap before disappearing into the forest. Thomas buried Henry on a hillside overlooking the creek where he died. He wrapped the body in canvas, piled stones over the grave to protect it from scavengers, and marked the spot with a wooden cross carved from pine. He spoke no words over the grave. Henry had not been a religious man, and Thomas felt that silence honored his partner better than empty prayers. But as he stood looking down at the pile of stones, something changed inside Thomas Makepeace. The abstract danger of mountain life became concrete and personal. He spent that night alone in camp, unable to sleep. The reality of what a grizzly bear could do to a man kept replaying in his mind. Henry had been competent, careful, and armed. None of it had mattered. The bear had killed him in seconds. Thomas realized something that would obsess him for months to come. Their camp, their methods, their entire approach to survival in grizzly country was built on hope rather than strategy. They hoped bears would avoid them. They hoped their camps would, to remain undiscovered. They hoped that if confrontation came, a rifle shot would be enough. Hope was not a plan. Over the next 4 weeks, Thomas continued trapping alone to complete the season's work. But his attention had shifted. He started paying careful attention to how bears interacted with bait. He visited other trappers' camps within a day's travel, asking questions about bear encounters. He examined abandoned cabins torn apart by grizzlies. He studied tracks around destroyed meat caches and overturned traps. A pattern emerged. Bears were not random forces of nature. They were intelligent, methodical problem solvers. When they encountered bait, whether intended for them or for other animals, they approached it with systematic caution. They circled first, checking for threats. They tested structures with their noses and paws, looking for weaknesses. If they determined the bait was accessible and undefended, they committed fully. And once committed, they were nearly impossible to drive away. Thomas met a trapper named Jacob Raleigh who had survived a bear attack on his cabin the previous winter. The bear had been drawn by the smell of meat drying inside. It had pushed on the door until the leather hinges tore free, entered the cabin, destroyed Jacob's food supplies, and left only when nothing edible remained. Jacob had survived by climbing into the small loft space and waiting for the animal to leave. He described the experience with visible shame, hiding in his own shelter while a bear demolished everything below. Thomas asked Jacob how he had baited for bears before the attack. Jacob shrugged. He hung meat from tree branches, scattered scraps near dens, used simple deadfall traps, the same methods every trapper used. Sometimes they worked, often they did not. Bears were unpredictable, Jacob said. You could not control them. Thomas disagreed. You could not control a bear's existence, but you could control where it went and what it found when it got there. Spring came to the mountains in late April. The ice broke on the creeks, beaver became active again, and trappers began the journey east to sell their winter's work. Thomas packed his 47 pelts onto 2 horses and started the 3-week ride to Street Louis. The journey gave him time to think. He had spent the winter sketching ideas in his journal, rough drawings of structures, notes about bear behavior, questions about materials and methods. He had no formal education in engineering or architecture, but he understood that someone, somewhere, had solved problems similar to his. He just needed to find those solutions and adapt them. Street Louis in 1837 was a booming frontier city, the last major settlement before the wilderness began. Thomas sold his pelts to a trading company for a decent profit, enough to fund another year in the mountains with money left over. Most trappers would have spent their earnings on whiskey, gambling, and entertainment before heading back west. Thomas spent his on education. He walked the streets studying buildings. He watched carpenters constructing a new warehouse near the riverfront and paid careful attention to how they reinforced corners and door frames. He examined brick structures, noting how the interlocking pattern distributed weight and created strength without any single point of failure. He visited the docks and observed sailors working with rope, learning how they created tension systems that held enormous loads using nothing but hemp and knowledge of knots. People thought he was strange. This bearded mountain man in buckskin clothing would stand for hours watching construction work, asking questions, taking notes in a battered journal. But Thomas did not care what people thought. He was learning principles that few trappers understood, principles he could apply to a very specific problem. After 2 weeks of observation, Thomas visited the trading post run by Silas Brennan, a man who supplied mountain men with everything they needed for wilderness survival. Thomas's order was unusual. He wanted 60 feet of heavy hemp rope, the best quality available. He wanted 12 iron brackets, each capable of bearing significant weight. He wanted a specialized draw knife for shaping wood, and he wanted 40 pounds of square-cut nails. Silas raised his eyebrows at the request. Rope was expensive. On the frontier, it had to be shipped upriver from New Orleans. Iron hardware was heavy and costly. Most trappers bought powder, lead, coffee, salt, maybe tobacco. They did not buy carpentry supplies. "Building something permanent?" Silas asked. "Something that needs to last?" Thomas replied. "Most mountain men build light, easier to move when the trapping plays out. I am not planning to move." Silas filled the order without further questions, though he mentioned to another customer later that day that Makepeace had either found a rich claim he wanted to protect or had lost his mind to grief. Other trappers at the post heard about Thomas's purchases and made jokes. Rope and nails would not catch beaver. Iron brackets would not shoot deer. Thomas was wasting money on supplies that had no place in a trapper's kit. Thomas loaded his unusual cargo onto pack horses and started the long journey back to the mountains. Thomas returned to the mountains in late July. The location where Henry had died still haunted him, but he did not avoid it. Instead, he selected a site 50 yards from his cabin in a natural clearing surrounded by pine forest. The spot offered clear sight lines in all directions, high ground that would drain well during rain, and enough open space that anything approaching would be visible long before it arrived. Most trappers built camps near water for convenience. Thomas was building for visibility and control. He spent the first 3 days doing nothing but cutting trees. He did not want just any logs, he needed poles of specific dimensions. He walked through the forest examining hundreds of trees before selecting the ones he wanted. They had to be straight, uniform in diameter, and free of excessive branching. He needed 12 poles, each roughly 8 feet long and 6 inches thick. He felled the trees, stripped them of bark and branches, and hauled them to his clearing using a rope harness. On the 4th day, Jacob Raleigh and Robert Fenn stopped by during their travels between trap lines. They found Thomas in the clearing, working with his draw knife to shape the poles to exact specifications. The ground around him was covered with wood shavings. He had been working since dawn. "What are you building, Makepeace?" Jacob asked. "A structure," Thomas replied without looking up from his work. "Can see that." "Structure for what?" "For bears," Robert laughed. "You building a bear a house? Maybe teach him to pay rent?" Thomas set down his draw knife and stood. He pointed to marks he had made in the dirt, a geometric pattern outlining where each pole would be positioned. "I am building something that will bring a bear exactly where I want it and keep it there long enough to kill it." Jacob studied the marks in the dirt. "Looks like you are building a monument." "In a way, I suppose I am." The two trappers watched for another hour as Thomas began driving the poles into the ground. He had brought a heavy maul for the purpose, and the work was brutal. The summer sun had baked the earth hard, and each pole required dozens of strikes to set it deep enough to remain stable. Thomas worked methodically, checking measurements between poles, adjusting angles, ensuring everything aligned with his plan. "How long you been working on this?" Robert asked. 4 days so far." "How long till you are finished?" "Another week, maybe 2. Jacob shook his head. "You could build a whole cabin in that time. Could run 3 trap lines and make actual money." Thomas wiped sweat from his face and looked at Jacob directly. "Henry died because a bear took him by surprise at a bait site. I am not going to let that happen again. Not to me. Not to anyone else if I can help it." The skepticism on Jacob's face softened slightly, but he still looked doubtful. "Lot of work for one bear." "Then it will be one very dead bear," Thomas said, and returned to his labor. The wooden framework took 9 days to complete. Thomas arranged the 12 poles in a pyramidal configuration, 4 forming a square base driven deep into the earth, 4 more angling inward from the corners, and the final 4 creating a peaked center structure. He used his expensive rope to lash the poles together at intersection points, wrapping and knotting with techniques he had learned watching sailors in St. Louis. The structure stood 6 feet tall at its apex and covered an area roughly 8 feet square at its base. It looked like the skeleton of some strange monument rising from the forest floor. With the framework complete, Thomas turned his attention to filling to it. This required a different kind of work entirely. He needed game animals not for food, but for bait. Over the next 2 weeks, he hunted with singular focus. He killed 2 mule deer, 1 elk cow, and another large deer. Each time he made a kill, he field-dressed the animal only partially. He removed the intestines to reduce immediate spoilage, but he left everything else intact: organs, blood, meat, hide, skull, antlers. He wanted the carcasses as complete and fresh as possible. He used his horses to drag the carcasses back to his clearing. The work was exhausting and time-consuming. Each animal weighed between 150 and 400 pounds. The elk required an entire day to transport from the kill site to the pyramid, but Thomas worked without complaint. He had a vision of what he was building, and every element mattered. He began arranging the carcasses on the wooden framework. The heaviest the elk went at the base, positioned so its body mass helped anchor the entire structure. The deer carcasses were layered above and around it, creating a pyramid of flesh and bone. Thomas used more rope to bind the animals to the wooden poles, wrapping cord around legs, through rib cages, around necks. He cinched everything tight, creating a unified mass that could not be easily pulled apart or dragged away. The skulls and antlers he positioned with particular care. He wanted them visible from a distance, jutting outward from the structure at dramatic angles. The elk skull, with its massive antlers, crowned the top. Deer skulls were placed at the corners, their smaller antlers creating a bristling appearance. Thomas understood that predators responded to visual cues as much as scent. The pyramid needed to look like what it was, a monument of death and abundance. Jacob Raleigh visited again during the construction. He stood at the edge of the clearing, staring at what Thomas had created. The structure was beginning to smell strongly. Blood had dripped and pooled on the ground. Flies swarmed around exposed meat. The antlers cast strange shadows in the afternoon sun. "Makepeace's madness," Jacob said quietly. "That is what they are going to call this." Thomas was on his knees, securing the final deer carcass with rope. "Let them call it whatever they want. You just used 4 animals' worth of meat for bait. That is 2 weeks of hunting wasted, plus all that rope had to cost you $40, $50 at least. Henry's life was worth more than $50 in 2 weeks. With the carcasses secured to the framework, Thomas began the final and most critical phase of construction. He had observed during his winter studies that bears relied heavily on scent to locate food, especially in cold weather when visual hunting was difficult. Blood carried scent better than any other substance. It dispersed through air and across snow in ways that solid meat could not match. Thomas intended to create a scent beacon that would draw bears from miles away. He used his knife to open additional cuts in the carcasses, targeting major blood vessels in the legs and necks. The animals had been dead for days, and much of their blood had already coagulated, but enough remained to serve his purpose. He worked methodically, cutting and positioning the bodies so blood would drain downward, pooling on the ground around the pyramid's base. The snow early autumn had brought the first dustings, absorbed the blood, and turned crimson. Thomas did not stop there. He had saved buckets of blood from the initial field dressing of each animal. He had kept it in sealed containers, knowing he would need it for this exact purpose. Now he poured it in a deliberate circle around the structure, creating a crimson ring 20 feet in diameter. The contrast against the white ground was dramatic. From any distance, the blood circle would be visible, a stark announcement that death and meat waited at the center. He tore chunks of flesh from the carcasses and scattered them at intervals leading toward the pyramid. Not enough meat to satisfy a bear, but enough to create a trail of increasing abundance. A bear following its nose would find small rewards that led inexorably toward the main structure. Thomas was building a path of escalating temptation. William Garrett arrived that afternoon. He was an older trapper, cautious and experienced, who had survived 15 winters in the mountains. He had heard from Jacob Raleigh about Thomas's strange construction project and came to see for himself. He stood at the edge of the clearing, studying the pyramid with a critical eye. "You are trying to bait bears," Garrett said. "I am guaranteeing bears come to a specific location. Bait works without all this." Garrett gestured at the elaborate structure. "Hang a haunch from a tree. Bear finds it, you shoot the bear. Simple." Thomas walked to where Garrett stood and pointed at the pyramid. "A haunch in a tree, the bear grabs it and runs. Into cover. You get 1 shot maybe, if you are lucky and positioned right. This," he indicated the structure, "this they cannot move. The rope anchors it. They cannot drag it away. They have to stay and feed in the open, where I control the engagement." Garrett shook his head. "You lost your mind after Henry died." "Grief does that sometimes. Blood on snow is visible for miles," Thomas continued, as if Garrett had not spoken. "The scent carries on wind. Bears are intelligent. They look for visual confirmation of what their nose tells them. They see this from a distance. They know it is real. They know it is abundant. They cannot resist the combination. You built a pyramid of rotting meat and spent a month doing it. That is madness." Thomas met his eyes. "Then call me mad. But when this works, remember what you saw here." Thomas completed the final element of his system on a cold morning in late September. He ran 2 long ropes from the pyramid structure. One anchored to a heavy iron ring he had bolted into the logs of his cabin wall, the other tied to a massive pine tree at the far edge of the clearing. The ropes created a tension system that held the pyramid rigidly in place. Wind could not topple it. An animal could not drag it. The structure was now a permanent fixture, exactly as Thomas had intended. He cleaned his rifle, checked his powder, and shot, and settled in to wait. He had positioned a chair near his cabin window with a clear view of the pyramid 60 yards away. The rope that ran to his cabin passed through a small notch in the window frame. If anything disturbed the structure, Thomas would feel the tension change through the rope. He could monitor the bait without constant visual surveillance. The first night passed quietly. The second night brought rain that washed some of the blood deeper into the soil, but did not eliminate the scent. On the third morning, Thomas woke to find tracks. A large grizzly, probably a male, based on the size of the prints had visited during the night. Thomas read the story written in disturbed earth and crushed vegetation. The bear had approached from the northeast, moving slowly, circling the structure 3 times before committing. It had stood at the blood circle's edge for several minutes, judging by the depth of prints where it had paused. Then it had moved to the pyramid itself. The bear had tested the structure with its nose, pushing against the wooden poles. It had bitten at one of the anchor ropes, leaving tooth marks in the hemp. It had tried to pull one of the deer carcasses free, but the rope binding held firm. Unable to drag away a piece, the bear had fed directly from the structure, tearing chunks of meat and eating them on sight. Based on the amount of missing flesh, the animal had spent at least 20 minutes feeding before retreating back into the forest. Thomas knelt beside the tracks, measuring them with his hand. The front paw print was 9 inches across. This was a mature male, probably weighing 600 pounds or more. Large enough to be dangerous, smart enough to be cautious. The bear had tested every aspect of the structure, checking for threats, looking for weaknesses, determining whether the food source was worth the risk. Thomas felt a surge of vindication. The pyramid had worked exactly as designed. The bear had found it, been unable to relocate it, and been forced to feed in the exact location Thomas had chosen, but Thomas did not shoot, not yet. He wanted the bear to return, to become comfortable with the site, to commit fully without caution. He spent the day repairing the damage, adding fresh meat where the bear had fed, tightening the ropes, spreading more blood. That night he sat by his window, hand resting lightly on the anchor rope. Near midnight he felt it. The rope jerked once, then went taut. The bear had returned. The bear visited 3 more times over the next 2 weeks, each visit following the same pattern. It would approach after dark, circle the structure, feed for 15 to 20 minutes, then retreat. Thomas watched from his cabin window each time, feeling the rope tension shift, observing the dark shape moving around his pyramid. He never fired. He was waiting for the perfect conditions, conditions that would give him every possible advantage. November brought the first major blizzard. Thomas woke on the 8th day of the month to find the sky heavy with clouds the color of old iron. The temperature had dropped overnight, and the wind carried the smell of snow. By mid-morning, the storm arrived in earnest. Snow fell in thick curtains, driven horizontal by gusting wind. Visibility collapsed to 20 yards, then 10. The forest disappeared behind sheets of white. The cold was bitter, penetrating, the kind that could kill an exposed man in hours. Most trappers would have stayed inside during such weather. Traditional wisdom said you did not hunt in blizzards. You could not see danger approaching. You could not track wounded game. You could not judge distances for accurate shooting. But Thomas had learned something during his months of studying bear behavior, something that contradicted conventional knowledge. Bears became bolder during storms. They felt concealed by the reduced visibility, protected by the same conditions that made humans helpless. A bear that would never approach a human structure in clear daylight would walk past cabins during blizzards, confident in the storm's cover. Thomas had bet his entire strategy on this observation. The pyramid bait was designed to work specifically in conditions like these. He checked his structure through the window. The pyramid stood firm against the wind. The rope anchors held it stable. Snow accumulated on the wooden framework and carcasses, but the elevation kept the meat visible. Most importantly, the bloodstains remained distinct against the white ground. Even through the blizzard, the crimson circle was visible, a stark beacon that promised food to any predator desperate or bold enough to venture out. Thomas loaded his rifle with extra care, checking the powder, seating the ball firmly, ensuring the percussion cap was dry and secure. He pulled on his heaviest coat, wrapped a scarf around his face, and positioned himself at the window. Then he waited. The storm intensified through the afternoon. The temperature continued dropping. The wind howled through the pines. Thomas sat motionless, watching his pyramid through the driving snow. The anchor rope lay across his lap. If the bear came, he would feel it before he saw it. 2 hours before sunset, the rope moved. Not the gentle shift of wind pressure, but a sharp jerk, something large, disturbing the structure. Thomas leaned forward, peering through the storm. For a long moment he saw nothing but snow. Then a shape materialized at the pyramid, dark against white, massive. The grizzly had returned, and in the blizzard's fury, it had come during daylight. The bear stood on its hind legs, both paws on the structure, pulling at frozen meat. It was exactly where Thomas needed it to be. Thomas rose from his chair slowly, careful not to make sudden movements that might be visible through the window. The bear was 40 yards away, fully committed to the pyramid, tearing at the frozen carcasses with both paws. The blizzard provided cover in both directions. The bear could not see Thomas clearly, but Thomas had the advantage of knowing exactly where his target would be. He had planned for this moment, measured the distance, understood the angles. He opened the cabin door and stepped into the storm. The cold hit him immediately, wind-driven snow stinging his exposed skin. He moved carefully, keeping his rifle dry under his coat until the last possible moment. The bear was so focused on feeding that it did not notice his approach. Thomas could hear it now. Over the wind, the sound of tearing meat, breaking bone, the animal's heavy breathing as it worked to free chunks of frozen flesh from the rope-bound structure. Thomas advanced to 35 yards, then 30. He wanted to be close enough that the blizzard would not affect his shot. The bear was still on its hind legs, both paws gripping the pyramid framework, its entire chest exposed. It was the same animal that had been visiting for weeks. Thomas recognized the scars on its shoulder, the distinctive size, the cautious intelligence in how it worked at the structure. This was almost certainly the same bear that had killed Henry. Thomas felt no anger, no desire for revenge, only a cold clarity about what needed to happen. At 25 yards, Thomas stopped. He pulled his rifle from beneath his coat and raised it smoothly to his shoulder. The bear's chest filled his sight picture. He aimed for the point where the front leg joined the body, targeting the heart and lungs. The wind gusted, driving snow across his vision, but at this distance he could not miss. He exhaled, slowly, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound flat and compressed in the storm. The bear dropped instantly from the structure, falling forward into the snow. It tried to rise, managed to get its front legs underneath itself, then collapsed again. Thomas had hit precisely where he aimed the ball, had passed through both lungs. The bear was dying, though it did not yet know it. Thomas reloaded quickly, hands steady despite the cold, but the second shot was unnecessary. The bear shuddered once, then lay still. Thomas approached cautiously, rifle ready, but the animal was dead. He knelt beside it, placing one hand on the massive shoulder. The bear was exactly as large as the tracks had suggested, probably 650 pounds, mature male, well-fed despite the approaching winter. Its claws were worn from digging, its teeth yellowed with age. This was an experienced animal, one that had survived many years in the mountains and had learned to exploit easy food sources, like trappers' bait piles and undefended camps. The pyramid stood behind the dead bear, slightly damaged where the animal had been feeding, but still structurally sound. 3 months of planning, 2 weeks of construction, 20 days of patient waiting, all of it justified in a single moment. Thomas had engineered the perfect kill zone, and the method had worked exactly as designed. Thomas spent 3 days processing the bear. He took the hide, rendered the fat for oil, and salvaged the meat that was edible. The rest he left for scavengers. The pyramid structure he repaired and rebaited, not because he needed to kill another bear immediately, but because he wanted to test whether the method would work repeatedly. It did. Over the next month, 2 more bears visited the site. Thomas killed one, a younger male, that had been raiding traps in the area. The other he let go, a female that posed no threat. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. William Garrett heard the story from Jacob Raleigh, who had seen the dead grizzly and the intact pyramid structure. Garrett did not fully believe it until late December, when a bear broke into his own cabin while he was away checking traps. The animal destroyed his food stores, shredded his bedding, and left the interior uninhabitable. Garrett lost 3 weeks of supplies and nearly froze before he could rebuild adequate shelter. He arrived at Thomas's camp on a bitter January morning, his pride visibly damaged. "I need to learn what you did," Garrett said without preamble. Thomas did not gloat or remind Garrett of their previous conversation. He simply showed him. Over the next week, Thomas explained every element of the pyramid method: the wooden framework geometry that created stability, the rope lashing system that prevented disassembly, the anchor lines that kept the structure fixed in place, the importance of multiple carcasses to create sufficient scent and visual mass, the blood saturation technique that amplified attraction, the strategic positioning in open clearings where bears had to approach through visible ground. Most importantly, Thomas explained the blizzard timing principle, the counterintuitive discovery that bears were more aggressive during storms, not less. Garrett built his own pyramid structure in February. Within 6 days, he killed the bear that had destroyed his cabin. He showed the method to Robert Fenn, who showed it to 2 other trappers. By spring of 1838, 5 pyramid bait structures stood in clearings across northern Montana wilderness. The technique continued spreading. Trappers gave it different names: monument baiting, pyramid trapping, the makepeace method. The core principles remained consistent: build stable framework, use multiple carcasses bound together, saturate with blood, anchor everything, position in open ground, wait for storms. Thomas left the mountains in 1844 as the fur trade collapsed. He bought land in Oregon Territory, married in 1846, and lived quietly as a farmer. He never promoted his invention or sought credit, but the method persisted. Into the 1850s and 60s, settlers and ranchers built pyramid structures to eliminate dangerous bears. The technique saved lives by preventing attacks before they happened. Thomas died in 1871 at age 62, surrounded by family who knew him only as a quiet farmer. His gravestone mentioned nothing of the wilderness or his innovation. But in the mountains, the legacy remained not in monuments or records, but in a technique born from grief that transformed desperation into systematic survival. A pyramid of wood, rope, and death that proved sometimes the best way to survive the wilderness was not to fight it, but to engineer it.